The clock on the wall showed 10:47 p.m. when Lisa finally wiped down her last table. Her feet ached in a way that went beyond normal tiredness. 3 years of working at Antonio's Fine Dining had taught her exactly how many steps she took during a dinner shift. Someone had actually calculated it once. 12 miles. 12 miles of walking back and forth, carrying plates, refilling wine glasses, and smiling even when customers snapped their fingers at her like she was invisible. She untied her apron and folded it carefully, the way she always did. The fabric was worn at the edges, but she took pride in keeping it clean. Tomorrow she'd be back at 4 p.m. for another shift, and then she had her online marketing class at midnight. Sleep would happen somewhere in between, probably around 3 a.m. if she was lucky. Lisa was 24, though some days she felt twice that age. Her reflection in the restaurant's decorative mirrors showed a young woman with dark circles under her eyes. That concealer couldn't quite hide anymore. But her hands, those were what people rarely noticed. They were strong hands, calloused from carrying heavy trays, but also graceful in a way that seemed out of place in a restaurant uniform. Those hands used to do something completely different. They used to dance across piano keys in concert halls. They used to earn her standing ovations. But that was another life, one that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Lisa, hold on a second," called Tony, the restaurant manager, from behind the bar. He was counting the register, rubber banding stacks of bills with practiced efficiency. She walked over, hoping this wasn't about switching shifts again. Her schedule was already a jigsaw puzzle that barely fit together. "Mr. Whitmore wants to talk to you before you leave," Tony said, not looking up from his counting. Lisa's stomach tightened. Richard Whitmore. Table 12. The man who came in every Thursday like clockwork. Always ordered the most expensive wine. Always left exactly 10% tip, no matter how perfect the service was. And always had this way of looking at people like they were part of the furniture. She found him still sitting at his table, swirling the last bit of wine in his glass. He was in his mid-50s with silver hair styled in that way that screamed expensive salon, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Lisa made in 3 months. "Ah, Lisa," he said, as if they were old friends. They weren't. "Sit down for a moment." She remained standing. "Is everything all right with your meal, Mr. Whitmore?" "I can get the manager if—" "Everything was adequate," he interrupted, which was his version of a compliment. "I have a business proposition for you." Lisa blinked. In 3 years, she'd heard a lot of propositions from wealthy men at this restaurant. Most of them she'd learned to deflect with a polite smile and a quick exit, but something in his tone made her pause. "I'm hosting a party this Saturday night, my daughter's engagement celebration. We need extra servers, and I specifically want you there." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of a massive estate with perfectly manicured gardens. "The pay is $300 for 4 hours of work." Lisa's mental calculator started running immediately. $300. That was almost a week's worth of her regular shifts. That was 2 textbooks for next semester. That was finally getting her car's check engine light looked at. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "What's the catch?" Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No catch. You're a good server. Professional. I want my daughter's party to be perfect." Something about the way he said it felt off, like there were words hiding beneath the words. But $300 was $300. "What's the dress code?" she asked. "Same as here. Black and white, professional. Be at the address at 5 p.m. sharp. Don't be late." He stood up, adjusting his cufflinks. Then as he was putting on his coat, he paused and turned back to her. "I heard something interesting about you the other day." Lisa's heart started beating faster. "Oh?" "One of my associates mentioned that his daughter went to Riverside Conservatory. Said there was a girl there a few years back who was supposed to be the next big thing. Piano prodigy. Then she just disappeared." His eyes locked onto hers. "Dropped out in her 2nd year. He said her name was Lisa Chen." The air seemed to leave the room. Lisa hadn't heard anyone mention the conservatory in over 2 years. She'd worked hard to keep those 2 parts of her life completely separate. "That's a common name," she managed to say, but her voice came out weaker than she intended. Richard's smile widened. "Is it? Well, anyway, see you Saturday. Oh, and Lisa, wear comfortable shoes. It's a big house. Lots of walking." He dropped 3 $20 bills on the table, his standard 10%, and walked out. Lisa stood there for a long moment, staring at the money on the table. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she clasped them together to make it stop. Tony came over with the broom. "You okay? You look like you saw a ghost." "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired." She gathered her things and walked out into the cold night air. The parking lot was nearly empty, just her beat-up Honda Civic sitting under a flickering streetlight. As she unlocked the door, her phone buzzed with an email notification. Another reminder that her student loan payment was coming due, $300 for 4 hours of work. She couldn't say no, even if every instinct told her that Richard Whitmore knew exactly who she was and what she used to be. Lisa sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine. Through the restaurant window, she could see the corner of the dining room where they kept their piano. It was just for decoration, really. They hired someone to play on Friday and Saturday nights, soft background music that nobody really listened to. She'd walked past that piano every single shift for 3 years and never once touched it. The conservatory felt like a lifetime ago. She remembered the way her professor's face had fallen when she'd come to his office to withdraw. "You're making a mistake," he'd said. "You have a gift, Lisa, real talent. Don't throw it away." But he didn't understand. He didn't know what it was like to sit in a hospital room while your mother went through chemotherapy, watching the bills pile up higher and higher. He didn't know what it was like to choose between your dreams and someone's life. Her mother had passed away 18 months ago, on a Tuesday morning while Lisa was at work. She'd gone quickly in the end, which everyone said was a blessing. But blessings don't erase debt. Blessings don't pay for experimental treatments that insurance calls not medically necessary. Blessings don't give you back the time you lost. Lisa started her car and pulled out of the parking lot. The radio was broken, stuck on a classical music station that she never changed because, well, what was the point? A piano concerto was playing, something by Chopin. Her fingers twitched on the steering wheel, following the melody from muscle memory. Saturday night. A wealthy man's party. $300. And somehow Richard Whitmore knew about her past. As she drove home through empty streets, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something. The way he'd smiled when he mentioned the conservatory. The way he'd emphasized comfortable shoes like it was some kind of inside joke she wasn't in on yet. But she needed that money. She needed it badly enough to ignore the warning bells going off in her head. Sometimes when you're drowning, you grab onto anything that floats, even if you can't quite tell whether it's a life raft or an anchor. Saturday arrived faster than Lisa wanted it to. She'd spent the week trying to convince herself that she was overthinking things, that Richard Whitmore was just a wealthy man who needed servers and nothing more. But every time she thought about the way he'd said her full name, the way he'd mentioned the conservatory, that knot in her stomach tightened. The address he'd given her led to a neighborhood that didn't feel real. The kind of place where the driveways were longer than her entire street. Massive iron gates opened automatically as she approached, like the house itself was expecting her. The driveway curved through gardens that looked like something from a magazine, every hedge trimmed to perfection, every flower arranged just so. The house, no, mansion, was even more impressive in person. 3 stories of white stone with columns that reached up to a balcony, windows that sparkled in the late afternoon sun. Lisa parked her car in the area marked for staff next to a row of catering vans. Her Honda looked incredibly out of place next to the luxury vehicles scattered around the main entrance. She grabbed her bag and headed toward the service entrance, where a woman with a clipboard was checking people in. She was probably in her 30s, wearing all black with her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. "Name?" the woman asked without looking up. "Lisa Chen." The woman's pen paused for just a fraction of a second. Then she checked something off and handed Lisa a badge. "You're on champagne duty. The trays are in the kitchen. Event starts at 6. Guests start arriving at 5:30. Mr. Whitmore wants everyone in position by 5:45. Questions? Where do I follow the others? Stay professional. Don't talk to guests unless they address you first. Don't take out your phone. Don't eat the food. Don't drink the champagne." She was already looking past Lisa to the next person in line. Inside, the house was even more overwhelming. The ceiling seemed impossibly high, with crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than Lisa's entire education. The floors were marble, the kind that echoed with every footstep. Paintings. Hung on the walls, real ones, the kind you'd see in museums. But what stopped Lisa in her tracks was the piano. It sat in the main ballroom like a piece of art itself. A concert grand polished so perfectly that it reflected the chandelier above it. Steinway & Sons, if Lisa wasn't mistaken. The lid was open, showing the strings inside. It was positioned right in the center of the room where everyone would see it. Beautiful, isn't it? Lisa jumped slightly. Richard Whitmore had appeared beside her, seemingly from nowhere. He was wearing a tuxedo now, looking every bit the wealthy host. Very, Lisa managed to say, pulling her eyes away from the instrument. Do you play? He asked, and there was that smile again. The one that didn't match his eyes. I should get to work, Mr. Whitmore. Where do you need me? Of course, work. He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. Though I should mention, we have a special entertainment planned for tonight. You might find it interesting. He walked away before she could respond, leaving Lisa standing there with a growing sense of dread. The kitchen was chaos. Caterers moved in synchronized efficiency, plating appetizers that looked like tiny works of art. Someone handed Lisa a tray of champagne flutes and pointed her toward the ballroom. 5 other servers were already moving through the space, straightening napkins, checking that everything was perfect. By 5:45, the first guests were arriving. They came in clusters, dressed in evening gowns and expensive suits, air-kissing each other and laughing at jokes Lisa couldn't hear. She moved through them like a ghost, offering champagne, clearing empty glasses, staying invisible the way good servers learn to do. But she couldn't stop glancing at that piano, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Richard's daughter, Victoria, arrived at 6:15 with her fiancé. She was young, maybe 22, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Lisa's car, but there was something genuine in her smile, the way she hugged her guests, the way she seemed actually happy to see people. Her fiancé, James, was quieter, more reserved, but he watched Victoria with the kind of look that suggested real affection. Lisa was refilling her tray in the kitchen when she heard the sound of a knife tapping against glass. The universal signal for a speech. She grabbed her tray and moved back into the ballroom, positioning herself near the wall where she could see but wouldn't be in the way. Richard stood on a small platform near the piano, microphone in hand, beaming at his guests. Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate Victoria and James's engagement. It means the world to our family to have you all here. Applause rippled through the room. Victoria smiled, though Lisa noticed she kept glancing at her father with something that might have been nervousness. Now, I know we have professional entertainment scheduled for later, Richard continued, but I thought we might start with something a bit more spontaneous. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Lisa. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Lisa Chen. Every head in the room turned toward her. Lisa's heart stopped. Lisa has been serving us tonight, doing an excellent job, I might add. But what you don't know is that Lisa has quite an interesting background. He paused for effect, and Lisa felt her face growing hot. Lisa used to study at Riverside Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Piano performance, if I'm not mistaken. A few murmurs went through the crowd. Some people were already smiling, like they were in on a joke Lisa didn't understand yet. She was supposedly quite talented. Some even said she might have had a real future in music. But then, Richard shrugged, the gesture somehow containing volumes of judgment. Well, life happens, doesn't it? Dreams don't pay the bills. Reality catches up with all of us eventually. Victoria's face had gone pale. She was saying something to James, but Lisa couldn't hear it over the rushing sound in her ears. So I thought, Richard continued, his voice taking on a tone of false generosity, why don't we give Lisa a chance to revisit those dreams? Lisa, would you play something for us? He gestured toward the piano like he was offering her a gift. Consider it part of tonight's entertainment. Part of your job. The room had gone completely silent. 200 eyes staring at her. Some curious. Some already looking amused. Some looking uncomfortable, like they knew this was wrong but didn't want to make a scene. Lisa's hands gripped the champagne tray so hard her knuckles went white. She understood now. This whole thing had been planned. The generous pay, the specific request for her, the piano positioned right in the center of the room. He'd orchestrated this entire evening just to humiliate her, to turn her into a cautionary tale for his wealthy friends. I'm working, Mr. Whitmore, she said, and her voice sounded steadier than she felt. I'm here as a server, not a performer. Oh, come now, Richard said, his smile widening. Surely you remember how to play, or has it been so long that you've forgotten? That would be a shame. All that talent, all that training, just wasted. He let the word hang in the air like an accusation. Someone in the crowd laughed, a nervous titter that made Lisa's stomach turn. James stepped forward, his face uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't think—" "It's fine," Victoria interrupted, but her voice was tight. She was looking at her father with something that might have been anger or embarrassment or both. Lisa stood there, tray still in hand, doing the calculation she'd done 1,000 times before. She could walk out right now. Tell Richard Whitmore exactly where he could put his $300. Maintain her dignity. But $300 was $300. And walking out meant letting him win in a different way. Meant proving whatever point he was trying to make about dreams and reality, and people who fall short. She set down the tray carefully on a nearby table. Her hands were shaking, but she made them stop. She'd survived worse than this. She'd survived sitting in hospital rooms. She'd survived dropping out of school. She'd survived grief and debt and 3 years of swallowing her pride. She could survive this too. The walk to the piano felt like miles. Every step echoed in the silent room. People had formed a semicircle around the instrument like an audience at a concert, but their faces held something different than the faces she remembered from her student days. Then people had looked at her with expectation and hope. Now they looked at her with pity or amusement or curiosity about her failure. Lisa reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment, looking down at the keys. The last time she'd played had been the day before her mother's diagnosis. A practice room at the conservatory preparing for her jury exam. She'd been working on Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. She hadn't touched a piano in 2 years and 9 months, not once. Every time she'd walked past the one at Antonio's, she'd felt the pull, but she'd never given in. It hurt too much. It reminded her of everything she'd lost, everything she'd had to give up. Richard was watching her with that satisfied smile, like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. He thought he knew how this would go. She'd stumble through something simple, maybe a children's piece, and prove his point about wasted potential. Or she wouldn't be able to play at all, and that would be even better for his narrative. Lisa sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. The wood was warm, expensive. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and for a terrifying moment, she wondered if she really had forgotten. If all those years of training had just evaporated, if her hands wouldn't remember what her mind tried to forget. Then she placed her fingers on the keys, and everything else disappeared. Lisa closed her eyes and let her fingers find the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The piece started quietly, almost hesitantly, with soft chords that felt like questions being asked. Her hands moved without thinking, muscle memory taking over after nearly 3 years of silence. The first few bars were like coming home to a place you thought you'd forgotten. Her fingers found their way across the keys as if no time had passed at all. The piano's sound was incredible, rich and full. The kind of instrument she'd dreamed of playing back in her conservatory days but rarely got the chance to touch. She could feel the room behind her, all those people watching, waiting to see her fail. Richard Whitmore standing there with his smug expression, thinking he'd made his point. But something happened as she played. The humiliation, the anger, the exhaustion of the past 3 years, it all poured into the music. The piece began to build. Rachmaninoff didn't mess around. His second concerto was a monster of a composition, demanding everything from the pianist. Technical precision, emotional depth, physical stamina. It was the kind of piece that separated serious pianists from everyone else. Lisa's hands began to move faster, dancing across the keys, the melody swelling from gentle whispers into something powerful. Her right hand climbed up the keyboard while her left hand provided the foundation, the bass notes that grounded everything. She'd practiced this piece for months back at the conservatory, sometimes for 6 hours a day until her fingers cramped and her back ached. Her professor had told her she was ready to perform it in competition. That was supposed to happen the month after she withdrew. The music grew louder, more intense. Her fingers flew across the keys in cascading runs that required absolute precision. One wrong note, one missed finger placement, and the whole thing would fall apart. But her hands remembered. They remembered everything. She opened her eyes slightly and caught a glimpse of her reflection in the piano's polished surface. For a moment, she saw herself as she used to be. Not a tired waitress with circles under her eyes, but a pianist, a musician, someone with talent and purpose and a future that made sense. The melody shifted into the famous romantic theme, the part that everyone recognized even if they didn't know Rachmaninoff's name. It was achingly beautiful, the kind of music that reached into your chest and grabbed your heart. Lisa poured everything into it. Every late night at the hospital, every bill she couldn't pay, every dream she'd had to pack away like old clothes that didn't fit anymore. She thought about her mother, who'd made her promise not to drop out. "Keep playing," she'd said from that hospital bed, her voice weak but firm. "Don't give up your music for me." But how could Lisa keep playing when her mother was dying? How could she sit in a practice room playing Rachmaninoff while someone she loved was fighting for their life? The music built toward the climax of the first movement. Her hands crossed over each other, hitting notes that seemed impossible to reach. The technical difficulty was insane, but she didn't think about it. She just played. The sound filled the entire ballroom, bouncing off the high ceilings, making the crystal chandeliers vibrate with resonance. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Lisa realized that the room had changed. She couldn't hear anyone talking, couldn't hear glasses clinking, couldn't hear anything except the piano and her own breathing, and the absolute silence of 200 people who had stopped whatever they were doing to listen. She moved into a quieter section, letting the volume drop to almost nothing. Her fingers barely touched the keys, creating sounds so soft they were like whispers. This was the dangerous part, where any mistake would be obvious, where control mattered more than speed. But her hands stayed steady. This was the music she'd been running from for 3 years. This was the part of herself she'd tried to bury under double shifts and student loans and the daily exhaustion of just surviving. But it had been there the whole time, waiting. And now it was pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. The piece built again, climbing toward the conclusion of what she'd decided to play. She hadn't planned to perform the entire concerto. That would take 40 minutes and required an orchestra. But she was playing a substantial portion, the parts that mattered most, the parts that showed exactly what she could do. Her arms began to ache. It had been so long since she'd played anything this demanding. Her shoulders burned. Her back protested, but she pushed through it because this wasn't just about music anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been dismissed, every dream that got deferred. Every time someone looked at you and saw only what you'd lost instead of what you'd survived. She thought about Richard Whitmore, standing there in his expensive tuxedo, thinking he could use her as entertainment, as a lesson about failure. But he'd made a mistake. He'd given her a piano. He'd given her an audience. He'd given her a chance to show everyone in that room exactly who she was. The music surged toward its final peak. Her fingers hammered out the powerful chords, the ones that required her whole body to create the force needed. She felt tears on her face but didn't stop to wipe them away. The piano sang under her hands, the Steinway's perfect engineering, turning her movements into something transcendent. She played the final cascading runs, her right hand flying up the keyboard while her left hand provided the thunderous bass. The technical difficulty was extraordinary, but she nailed every note. 3 years of not playing had melted away like they'd never happened. Her hands remembered. Her body remembered. She remembered. The final chord rang out, powerful and definite. She held it, letting it resonate through the room, her foot on the sustain pedal to let the sound linger. When it finally faded into silence, she lifted her hands from the keys and sat there breathing hard, her heart pounding. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, slow and deliberate. Lisa turned slightly and saw James, Victoria's fiancé, standing near the front with tears in his eyes. He was clapping like his life depended on it, his face showing something like wonder. Then someone else joined in, and another, and suddenly the entire room erupted in applause. Not polite charity clapping, real applause, the kind you hear in concert halls. People were standing up, some of them wiping their eyes, some of them just staring at her like they couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. Lisa stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs. Her hands were trembling now, all the adrenaline catching up with her. She looked out at the crowd of wealthy strangers in their expensive clothes, and they were looking back at her completely differently than they had 10 minutes ago. Victoria was crying openly, her mascara running. She was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. Several older women in the crowd were dabbing at their eyes with napkins. A man near the back was shaking his head slowly like he couldn't quite process what had just happened. and Richard Whitmore stood frozen near the platform where he'd given his speech. His face had gone pale. The smug smile was completely gone. He looked like someone had just rewritten the entire script he'd prepared, and he had no idea what to say next. The applause continued, wave after wave of it, and Lisa just stood there taking it in. She hadn't heard applause like this since her last recital at the conservatory. Before everything fell apart, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen not as a waitress or a dropout or someone who'd failed, but as a musician, as someone with real talent, as someone who mattered. An elderly woman in an elegant black gown was making her way through the crowd toward the piano. She was moving with purpose, people stepping aside to let her through. Lisa didn't recognize her at first. The woman looked older, her hair completely white now. But then something about her posture, her bearing, clicked into place. Professor Catherine Morrison, head of the piano department at Riverside Conservatory, one of the most respected piano teachers in the country. And the woman who had tried to convince Lisa not to drop out? Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Of all the people who could have been at this party, of all the possible guests, Professor Morrison was here, watching, listening. The professor reached the piano, and the applause began to fade as people realized something significant was happening. She looked at Lisa with eyes that held recognition and something else. Something like sadness mixed with hope. "Lisa Chen," she said, and her voice carried in the sudden quiet. "I wondered what happened to you. I've wondered for almost 3 years. Lisa couldn't find words. She just stood there, her hand still shaking, facing the woman who represented everything she'd left behind. "That was extraordinary," Professor Morrison continued. Her voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath it. "You've lost nothing. If anything, you're better than you were. There's something in your playing now that wasn't there before, something real." The room was dead silent now, everyone watching this moment unfold between the professor and the former student. "Why did you disappear?" Professor Morrison asked gently. "You were one of the most talented students I'd ever taught. When you withdrew, you wouldn't tell me why. You just said it was necessary and left. I tried to call, but your number was disconnected. I tried to find you, but you'd vanished." Lisa's throat was tight, all those memories flooding back. The day she'd walked into Professor Morrison's office and handed in her withdrawal papers. The professor had argued with her, had told her they could work something out, that leaving was a mistake. But how could Lisa explain that no scholarship or payment plan could cover what her mother needed? "I had family obligations," Lisa finally managed to say. "I had to leave. I didn't have a choice." Professor Morrison studied her face, and Lisa could see the moment understanding dawned. The professor had been teaching long enough to know what family obligations meant for a student who suddenly withdrew. Professor Morrison's expression softened in a way that made Lisa's eyes burn with tears she was trying hard to hold back. The professor reached out and took both of Lisa's hands in hers, turning them over gently to look at them. The calluses from carrying serving trays, the small burn mark from a hot plate, the evidence of 3 years of work that had nothing to do with pianos. "Tell me," the professor said quietly. But in the silent room everyone could hear. "What happened, Lisa?" And maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the adrenaline crash after the performance. Maybe it was just that Lisa had been holding everything inside for so long that she didn't have the strength to keep it contained anymore. Whatever the reason, the words started coming out. "My mother got sick," Lisa said, and her voice cracked on the word mother. "It was sudden. Stage 4. The doctors said she had maybe a year if she was lucky. But there were treatments. Experimental ones. They might have given her more time, maybe even put her into remission. But insurance wouldn't cover them. They said it wasn't medically necessary." The room stayed silent. People were leaning in now. Not with the cruel curiosity from before, but with something else, something human. "The treatments cost thousands. Tens of thousands. I had student loans, but they weren't enough. I had scholarships, but they only covered tuition. I had a part-time job, but it barely paid for groceries. So Lisa swallowed hard. "I withdrew. I got 2 full-time jobs. I worked 16-hour days sometimes. I did everything I could to pay for those treatments, to keep our apartment, to be there when she needed me." Professor Morrison's grip on her hands tightened, and Lisa saw tears in the older woman's eyes. "The treatments helped for a while. We got almost 2 years instead of 1. 2 years of time I wouldn't have had otherwise. 2 years of being there with her, talking with her, making sure she wasn't alone. Lisa's voice dropped to almost a whisper. She died 18 months ago, on a Tuesday morning while I was working a breakfast shift. I didn't make it to the hospital in time. Someone in the crowd made a small sound, quickly stifled. Lisa looked up and saw that half the room was crying. Not just the women, some of the men too. James had his arm around Victoria, who was sobbing into his shoulder. The treatments didn't cure her, Lisa continued, but they gave her time. And that time, that was worth everything I gave up. Every dream, every plan, every future I'd imagined. It was worth it. She looked directly at Richard Whitmore, who had gone even paler. So yes, I dropped out. Yes, I became a waitress. Yes, reality caught up with me, but not in the way you think. The silence that followed was different from before. It was heavy with emotion, with understanding, with the shared recognition of what it meant to sacrifice everything for someone you loved. Professor Morrison pulled Lisa into a hug, the kind of embrace that said more than words could. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "If I'd known, if you'd told me, we could have helped. The department has emergency funds. We could have—" "I know," Lisa said into the professor's shoulder. "But I was 21 and scared, and my mother was dying. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I needed money, and I needed it fast." They stood like that for a moment, teacher and former student, while 200 people watched and quietly processed what they'd just heard. Then Professor Morrison pulled back, wiping her eyes but keeping hold of Lisa's hands. "Your mother must have been incredibly proud of you," the professor said. Lisa laughed, but it came out choked. She was furious. "She told me every single day that I should go back to school, that I shouldn't give up my music for her. We argued about it constantly. She felt guilty about it until the day she died. But you played for her, didn't you?" the professor asked gently. Lisa nodded. "Every night in the hospital. They had an old keyboard in the recreation room. Nothing fancy, half the keys stuck. But I'd wheel her down there when she felt strong enough and I'd play. She'd close her eyes and listen, and for those minutes she wasn't sick. She was just my mom, listening to her daughter play piano." Victoria broke away from James and walked toward Lisa. Her face was blotchy from crying, her expensive makeup ruined, but she didn't seem to care. She stood there for a moment looking at Lisa with something like shame and anger and sadness all mixed together. "I'm so sorry," Victoria said, her voice thick. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what my father was planning. I thought—" She glanced back at Richard, who was standing very still. "I thought he was just hiring extra staff. I had no idea he was going to do this, to humiliate you like that." "It's not your fault," Lisa said, and she meant it. Victoria clearly had no part in her father's plan, but Victoria shook her head. "It is my fault. This whole party is my fault. If I hadn't insisted on having it here, if I hadn't wanted this big celebration, none of this would have happened." She turned to face her father directly. "How could you do this? What were you thinking?" Richard finally found his voice. "I was trying to teach a lesson about reality, about what happens when people aren't realistic about their abilities." About what?" James interrupted, and his voice had an edge Lisa hadn't heard before. "About humiliation? About kicking someone when they're down? What exactly was the lesson supposed to be?" Richard's mouth opened and closed. He looked around the room, but the faces staring back at him weren't friendly. People were looking at him with disappointment, with disgust, with the kind of social disapproval that probably mattered more to him than any words could. "I employ hundreds of people," Richard said, his voice defensive. "I understand how the world works. I understand that sometimes dreams don't work out. I was simply pointing out—" "You were being cruel," said an older man near the front. Lisa didn't know who he was, but from the way people reacted, he was important. "There's no lesson in what you did. There's no wisdom. There's just meanness." Another woman spoke up, her voice sharp. "My daughter works 2 jobs to pay for art school. She's talented, just like Lisa. Does that make her a failure? Does that make her someone to be mocked?" More voices joined in, a chorus of disapproval aimed at Richard. Lisa just stood there watching as the man who'd tried to humiliate her found himself facing the judgment of his own peers. People he'd invited to his home, people he wanted to impress, and they were all turning against him. Professor Morrison gently guided Lisa away from the piano, toward the edge of the room where they could talk more privately. But she pulled out her phone first and made a call right there in front of everyone. "David, it's Catherine. I know it's Saturday evening, but I need you to listen. Remember that emergency scholarship we discussed last month? The one for exceptional circumstances? I've found our candidate." She looked at Lisa while she talked. "Her name is Lisa Chen. She was one of my students. She left for family reasons, but her talent is extraordinary. I just heard her play, and David, she's the real thing. We need to get her back." Lisa's heart started pounding again. "Professor, I can't afford—" Professor Morrison held up one finger, still talking into the phone. "Full scholarship. Yes, everything. Tuition, fees, housing stipend. And I want her as my teaching assistant. She'll need income while she studies." A pause while she listened. "Trust me on this, David. I've been teaching for 35 years. I know talent when I hear it." She ended the call and turned to Lisa. "You'll need to audition officially, but that's just a formality. The committee will listen to you play and they'll approve the scholarship. I'll make sure of it. I still have student loans from before," Lisa said, her mind racing. "I still have debt from my mother's treatments. I still need to work. I can't just— We'll figure it out," the professor said firmly. "The teaching assistant position pays enough to cover basic expenses. We have connections with debt counselors who help students restructure loans. We have resources you didn't know about 3 years ago because you never asked. You were trying to handle everything alone, but you don't have to anymore." Victoria appeared beside them, holding an envelope. "This is for tonight," she said, pressing it into Lisa's hands. "The $300 my father promised you, plus a bonus from me. From my account, not his. I don't want you to lose money because of what he did." Lisa opened the envelope and found herself staring at $1,500 in cash. "This is too much." "It's not enough," Victoria said firmly. "But it's what I have on me right now." She hesitated, then continued. "I want to do something else too. I want to set up a scholarship fund for music students facing financial hardship. I'll call it in your mother's memory." "What was her name?" Lisa's vision blurred with tears. Margaret Chen. "The Margaret Chen Memorial Scholarship," Victoria said, as if trying out the words. "I'll fund it myself. My trust fund, my money. I'll make sure other students don't have to make the choice you made. Will you help me set it up? Help me make sure it goes to the right people?" Lisa couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. James stepped forward too. "I work in arts administration," he said. "I know people at concert halls, foundations, organizations that support emerging musicians. I'd like to help you rebuild your career if you're interested. No obligations, no strings, just connections and opportunities." Around them, other guests were approaching. A woman who ran a music festival offering a performance slot. A man who directed a community orchestra saying they needed a pianist. A couple who said their daughter took piano lessons and would love to study with someone who played like Lisa did. Offers of help, of support, of opportunities coming from every direction. Through it all, Richard Whitmore stood alone near the platform. His daughter wasn't looking at him. His future son-in-law had turned his back. His guests were ignoring him to talk to the waitress he'd tried to humiliate. The entire evening he'd orchestrated had turned against him in the most complete way possible. Lisa caught his eye across the room. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. She could have said something cutting, something that would drive home his failure. But looking at him, she just felt tired. And maybe a little sorry for him, because he'd probably never understand what he'd missed. He'd seen her as a cautionary tale and failed to see her as a person. A survivor. A musician who'd given up everything for love and somehow found her way back anyway. She turned away from him and back to the people surrounding her with kindness and offers and support. Professor Morrison had her arm around Lisa's shoulders, already talking about audition dates and class schedules. Victoria was on her phone, texting someone about scholarship paperwork. James was writing down contact information, promising to make introductions. For the first time in 3 years, Lisa felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning and grabbing at anything that floats, but the real kind. The kind that makes you believe tomorrow might actually be better than today. 3 months later, Lisa walked through the gates of Riverside Conservatory with a messenger bag over her shoulder and a coffee in her hand. It was early September, and the campus looked exactly as she remembered it. The old brick buildings with ivy climbing their walls, the practice rooms where you could hear a dozen different pieces being played at once, creating a strange but beautiful musical chaos. Students hurrying between classes, instrument cases in hand, sheet music tucked under their arms. She'd walked through these same gates 3 years ago in the opposite direction, carrying a box of her belongings and fighting back tears. She'd been certain she'd never come back. That chapter of her life had felt closed forever, the pages sealed shut by necessity and loss and debt that seemed impossible to overcome. But here she was, a returning student with a full scholarship, a teaching assistant position, and more opportunities than she knew what to do with. Sometimes she had to pinch herself to make sure it was real. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tony, her former manager at Antonio's. "How's the first day going, Maestro? We miss you here, but we're proud of you." Lisa smiled and typed back quickly. "So far, so good. Thanks for everything, Tony." She'd given notice at the restaurant 2 weeks ago. Tony had hugged her, told her she'd been one of his best servers, and then offered her weekend shifts if she ever needed extra money. "The door's always open," he'd said. "Some people surprised you with their kindness." The practice rooms were in the basement of Whitman Hall, the same building where Professor Morrison's office was located. Lisa made her way down the familiar stairs, past bulletin boards covered in concert announcements and masterclass flyers. She had a practice room reserved for the next 2 hours, time she needed to prepare for her official audition next week. The formality of the audition was just a technicality, like Professor Morrison had said. Lisa had already met with the scholarship committee informally. They'd heard her play a portion of the Rachmaninoff and some Bach preludes. The vote had been unanimous, but the conservatory had procedures and Lisa understood the importance of following them. She didn't want anyone to think she'd gotten special treatment, even if the circumstances were unusual. She unlocked practice room 7 and set her bag down. The room was small, barely big enough for the upright piano and a chair, with soundproofing on the walls that made everything feel muffled and separate from the world outside. She'd spent hundreds of hours in rooms like this one, practicing until her fingers ached and her back cramped, driven by a passion for music that she'd thought was dead but had only been sleeping. Lisa sat at the piano and ran through some scales to warm up. Her technique had returned faster than she'd expected. The muscle memory was still there, just waiting to be reawakened. But Professor Morrison had been right about something else, too. There was something different in her playing now, something that hadn't been there before. When she played sad pieces, she understood the sadness in a way she couldn't have at 21. When she played pieces about struggle and perseverance, she felt them in her bones. Her music had depth now, an emotional resonance that came from actually living through hardship instead of just imagining it. The best musicians, Professor Morrison had told her last week, are the ones who've experienced real life, who felt real loss and real joy. Your 3 years away weren't wasted, Lisa. They made you into a more complete artist. Lisa started working on the piece she'd selected for her audition, a Chopin nocturne. The notes flowed under her fingers, sweet and melancholic. Through the soundproof door, she could faintly hear someone else practicing something fast and intense, probably Liszt. The familiar soundtrack of conservatory life. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Victoria. "Scholarship committee meeting at 4, can you make it? Want your input on the first round of applications." The Margaret Chen Memorial Scholarship had become real faster than Lisa had imagined possible. Victoria had been serious about funding it herself, and she'd been smart about it too. She'd consulted with financial advisors, set up a proper foundation, and enlisted Lisa's help to design the application process in a way that would identify students who really needed it. They'd received 43 applications in the first month alone. Students from all over the country, studying various instruments, all facing financial hardships that threatened their ability to continue their education. Reading their stories had been heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. So many talented people struggling against circumstances beyond their control. Lisa typed back, "I'll be there. Looking forward to it." She set the phone aside and continued practicing, losing herself in the music the way she always had. Time disappeared when she played. 2 hours felt like 20 minutes. When her alarm went off, reminding her she had to head to her teaching assistant duties, she was surprised the practice session was already over. Professor Morrison's undergraduate music theory class was held in one of the larger lecture halls. Lisa's job as teaching assistant involved helping students during office hours, grading assignments, and occasionally leading review sessions. It wasn't difficult work. and it paid enough to cover rent for the small studio apartment she'd found near campus, plus groceries and basic expenses. The debt counselor the conservatory had connected her with had helped her restructure her student loans into a more manageable payment plan. Her mother's medical debt had been partially forgiven through a hospital financial assistance program she hadn't known existed. She still owed money, still had to be careful with spending, but it was no longer the crushing weight it had been. She could breathe. After class, Lisa walked across campus toward the administration building where the scholarship committee meeting would be held. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quad, where students sat on benches studying or chatting. A group was playing frisbee near the fountain. Everything felt so normal, so right, like she'd never left, but she had left. And she'd survived what came after. And that made being here now mean something different, something more. Victoria was already in the conference room when Lisa arrived, along with 3 other committee members they'd recruited. One was a financial aid administrator from the conservatory. Another was a music teacher from a public school who understood the challenges students from lower-income backgrounds faced. The third was a professional musician who'd put himself through school working construction jobs. Lisa, perfect timing, Victoria said, standing to hug her. They'd become real friends over the past few months, bonded by the scholarship work and a shared understanding of what that night at the engagement party had meant for both of them. Victoria had called off her engagement to James 2 weeks after the party. Not because of anything he'd done, but because she'd realized she was marrying him partly to please her father, and she was done making decisions based on what Richard Whitmore wanted. She and James were still friends, still cared about each other, but Victoria had decided she needed time to figure out who she was, separate from her family's expectations. Her relationship with her father remained strained. Richard had eventually apologized, a stilted, uncomfortable apology that felt more about saving face than genuine remorse. Victoria had accepted it but kept her distance. She'd moved into her own apartment, was working at a nonprofit, and seemed happier than Lisa had ever seen her. The committee meeting lasted 2 hours. They reviewed applications, discussed which candidates best fit the scholarship's mission, and selected 3 recipients for the first round. A violin student whose family had lost their home to a fire, a voice major whose parent was fighting cancer, a cello player who was supporting 2 younger siblings while attending school. Each story hit Lisa hard, reminding her of her own struggles. "Your mother would be proud," Victoria said quietly as they were packing up. "Of the scholarship, of you being back at school, of all of it." Lisa nodded, not trusting her voice. She thought about her mother every day, wished she could call her and tell her about returning to the conservatory, wished she could play for her one more time, in a better place than that hospital recreation room with the broken keyboard. But in a way, every time Lisa sat at a piano now, she was playing for her mother. Every note was a testament to the sacrifice they'd both made. Every performance was proof that the time they'd bought together, those extra 2 years, had been worth it. After the meeting, Lisa walked back to her apartment as the sun was setting. Her studio was small, but it was hers. She decorated it simply, a bed, a desk, a small kitchen table. And in the corner, taking up way more space than it probably should in a tiny studio apartment, was a digital keyboard. Not as nice as a real piano, but good enough for late-night practicing when the conservatory practice rooms were closed. She made herself dinner, something simple from a recipe her mother used to make. Then she sat at her desk and opened her